Greetings, everyone, and good afternoon. For those of you who may have not been able to participate in the earlier session with Dr. Mike Ellis, I'll just note that was recorded and will be posted later for your enjoyment. But if you missed my earlier introduction, I'm Dr. Troy Jansen. I am the Complaints Director, Deputy Registrar and Chief of Practice here at the College of Alberta Psychologists, and I'm glad to be your moderator for today's panel presentation. And we're delighted to be joined by a great array of colleagues from around Alberta as our panel presentation, targeting 4 specific topics related to supervision. Each panelist will be briefly sharing their insights, and we'll be encouraging all participants to use the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you move your mouse, you'll see a Q&A and a question mark. You click that to open it. I will be monitoring all Q&A, which we'll reserve for the end of the panel presentation, some opportunity. I'll apologize right now that we probably can't get to all the great questions you might have to ask. We'll do the best we can to get as many questions answered as we can, but we would definitely appreciate your participation in that. We'd ask to reserve it so that you don't use it for personal messaging. The Q&A is for questions for the speakers that you intend for us to address. In any case, I'd like to begin first by introducing our first panelist, Dr. Jeff Chang. Dr. Jeff Chang is a professor in the Faculty of Health Disciplines at Athabasca University. A registered psychologist since 1987, Jeff is a clinical fellow and approved supervisor in the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, and a registered marriage and family therapist supervisor mentor in the Canadian Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Jeff wrote and curates the Psychologists Association of Alberta's online supervision course and has provided supervision training to organizations across Canada. Jeff is also a CAP supervision consultant and a member of the Supervision Review Committee. His direct practice mainly consists of assessments in high conflict parenting situations, no small task. And Jeff also directs psychological services at an inclusive education school and co-supervises several provisional psychologists. Welcome, Jeff, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Troy. I'm just going to share my screen, and we have a whirlwind of 15 minutes. And fortunately, Dr. Ellis covered some of the ground that I'm going to cover. So it'll be helpful. So hopefully I can reemphasize it, and hopefully that'll be helpful. I'm going to, you've got my slides for a presentation that normally takes an hour or two or maybe more. And so what I'm going to do is point you to some specific slides, and I'm going to largely skip over others. And I'd be happy to go back in the Q&A to elaborate some stuff if you would like. I just want to position myself in terms of my intersectional identities and how I position myself culturally. And I'm born at the tail end of the baby boom. I'm old, Chinese Canadian, able-bodied and heterosexual and cis man. And I enjoy a certain amount of privilege from having some from being a man in this field, and being older. And I work hard to be in solidarity with others as much as I possibly can. I'm not going to recite my land acknowledgement because Troy kicked off the day with that. But I will say that one thing that I've become aware of is that if you look at the last part of this slide, the Canadian Psychological Association, in its response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, apologized for service delivery that apologized for not holding up our own ethics. And I want to take accountability for some of the culturally insensitive, at least culturally insensitive and potentially harmful service delivery that I participated in the past. I think it was all well-intentioned, but it wasn't adequate. I want to start out, so contracting is an interesting thing. Because but I want to put it in the context in which I think about it. In the spring 2024 CAP Monitor, I had a little piece in there about onboarding in clinical supervision. And onboarding, in my view, includes um, setting a relational stage for supervision. That means being intentionally transparent. Um, that means that when possible in our practice settings, we should make our work available to be viewed by others. I know some of my colleagues who have worked with me at certain times at the Calgary Family Therapy Center are here. And at the CFTC, it's required for new interns and practicum students to watch 5 sessions of a senior therapist before they can see anybody. I think we need to model transparency. And so my onboarding paper, if you want to refer to it, um, is talks about that and talks about the fact that um, um, that we, in my view, should be transparent about our intersectional identities and how personal issues may influence our service delivery. So I'm just going to put that out there. Contracting is in that context. I don't think I would like you to see it as something that stands alone, and it's not just a CYA thing. Somebody in the stated in the chat in Dr. Ellis's presentation that contracts are between people who don't trust each other in some cultures. And the last second bullet point here is that the whole concept of contracting is embedded in a colonial discourse. Our legal system is adversarial. Professional regulation, much as I know CAP and other professional regulators try and be restorative and collaborative, sometimes it is necessary to take action against people who misperform. So there are times when professional regulation is adversarial as well. Our legal system is adversarial. It's the Crown versus the accused, or it's Smith versus Smith in a divorce. So I just want to acknowledge that because there's traditions of law that existed in North America long before Europeans settled. I want to hit 4 key concepts, 4 key elements that are embedded within the set of slides you received. Supervisee vulnerability, and I'll be able to make short work of that because Dr. Ellis spoke so eloquently to that. Evaluation, risks and benefits, and due process dispute and just dispute resolution. The other thing that I want to just say is that about 2/3 of this presentation is based on a book by Janet Thomas. Um, I don't have access to the chat now, but I can put it up later. The reference from 2007. It's an American Psychological Association book and it's called The Ethics of Supervision and Consultation, Practical Guidance for Mental Health Professionals. So I'll put up that reference uh, in the chat later on. Sorry, just going to close. Okay, now I have just changed where things are on my screen. So can you still see the slides? Troy, give me a shout out.
We can.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, terrific. Because I'm on another screen. So yeah, these are the high points that I want to hit. And I just want to acknowledge Dr. Janet Thomas's contribution. Clients and so as Troy said earlier, CAP considers, and I certainly am on board with this, that supervisees, provisionals are service recipients, and our clients, whether we're doing therapy or assessment, all our service recipients are vulnerable, but in different ways. So if clients have the resources, they can choose to decline services or seek another service provider. As Dr. Ellis stated, maybe the most vulnerable people are people who are mandated by court or something like Children's Services to see us. But supervisees in the context of a practicum or a residency, They can choose to go elsewhere as well. But then if they do, their year is lost. Or to be in another program might not be all that easy. The other thing is that supervisees, whether they're practicum students or provisionals, their professional life is effectively in our hands. It's a high, a great deal of responsibility. And there's career vulnerability and economic vulnerability. One of the folks who sometimes consults with me about supervision has noticed that sometimes some provisionals are having a hard time making a living. And I don't think that's something that we've talked about enough. And it's important to just we don't have time to really unpack that. It's important to just acknowledge that. I'm going to skip down to so these are things that should be in a supervision contract. And I'm not going to really talk about these other than to give you a bit of a plug. Some of you may have seen, in my supervision column in PAA, that I'm really an advocate for live and or recorded supervision. I think, as Dr. Ellis said, would you want to go to an oncologist who only had talked about what they do and hadn't observed others do what they do? So, would you, if somebody wanted to be a professional musician or become highly proficient in a sport, they need to be observed directly. So do we. There's more at stake. So I just want to put that out there as part of this list. And these are all things that in my view, ought to be in um, various methods that we use in our supervision. Um, Legal liability for supervision is important to emphasize. Dr. Ellis was saying that the U.S. is way more litigious. Yes, but the leading bit of case law on this is Till v. Walker and the Victorian Order of Nurses. Walker, who was the nurse who made some egregious errors in the care of the patient, was considered responsible, and the employer, the Victorian Order of Nurses, was considered, so it was 25-75. The practitioner was 25, and the Victorian Order of Nurses were considered 75% liable by the court. But in the context of this, it's important. I want to emphasize that we have to develop a relational foundation of intentional transparency. I'm going to skip down to this part here, required disclosures. And someone that I'm just going to give a shout out to Jennifer Mitchell out there, somebody we have lots of conversations about supervision. And this term, required disclosures, is really important. I've fleshed out, we've talked about this a bit, and I've fleshed out this list. And so the context is that generally, I've worked as an external supervisor for provisionals who are working somewhere else where supervision from an appropriately qualified psychologist is not available. So these would be things that as a supervisor, I would say, you got to tell me about. Impasses in therapy. Often we hear about those. Excessive no-shows or non-response to contact, because there's some issues around abandonment of treatment versus, are we meeting a standard of care and following up? More required disclosures. Disputes with clients or stakeholders. I want to know if a client is disgruntled with a supervisee. Allegations of improper behavior by anybody. High-risk situations. Ethical violations by other professionals. Incidental contact with clients outside the service delivery setting. I ran into my client at the Safeway. Oh, I just realized that my kid plays on a soccer team, and one of the other moms on the soccer team is somebody that's been coming to see me for therapy. Um, Incidental contacts, because those need to be unpacked. Clients or guardians who are before the court in any way. So, as Troy noted, most of my direct practice is with high conflict divorcing families, and I do practice note 8 assessments. And that's one way that folks are before the court. But there's lots of other ways that folks are before the court. Those of you who are therapists to children, right? Um, of course, there might be significant implications for informed consent or just developing a relationship with parents so that you get people in the door the right way. But the more, some maybe more common, or they might seem less fraught at first, would be situations when somebody says, well, yeah, like I got in a car accident and my personal injury or my my automobile insurer might be interested to call you. Um, I'm gonna whoops, sorry. Janet Thomas recommends that we put something like this in a supervisory contract. And suggests that doing that mitigates supervisory liability if something else happens later. I'm going to go down to the dispute resolution, the risk and benefits section. An informed consent process needs to discuss risks and benefits. So you'll get better at what you do. You'll become more confident. You'll have the satisfaction of helping people change, or bringing your skills and knowledge to client situations. And you'll complete an important milestone in your professional career, your practicum, your registration hours. The risks are an emotional discomfort as a result of feedback, skill development, and client issues coming to bite you. But the other thing that's actually emphasizes our evaluative responsibility is there is a risk that a supervisee might not attain adequate competence within the allocated time, whether it's 2 semesters of practicum or 1,600 hours of supervised practice. Oops. Evaluation. Dr. Ellis mentioned that evaluation needs to be, the criteria need to be clear, and I would suggest using competency profiles to specify the benchmarks. And Troy's coming on, so it looks like I have to wind down.
Sorry, Dr.
That's
Chang.
okay.
I realize that
It
you've
went
got
fast.
lots of great material. 15 minutes goes by so incredibly quickly. Definitely appreciate that. We are now moving on to Dr. Dunn, and we definitely keep encouraging others to use the Q&A feature to write your questions, and we'll make sure we get to those at the end. I'd now like to welcome Dr. Erica Dunn, who currently works in private practice, offering counseling to individual adults and couples while also engaging in clinical supervision. Prior to starting in private practice, Erica worked at counseling and clinical services at the University of Alberta as the Associate Director and Director of Training, and led the team's residency program towards their inaugural accreditation with the Canadian Psych Association. Erica has been heavily involved in supervision throughout her career and currently sits as a member of CAP's Supervision Review Committee, and also serves as a volunteer supervision consultant for other members. Welcome, Erica, and I look forward to what you have to say.
Thanks, Troy. I'm just going to kindly ask Jeff if you wouldn't mind just stopping your screen share, because I can't share mine until you stop yours. Thank you. All right. gonna get my slides going here. All right. Well, hello, everybody. As Troy said, my name's Erica, and I am here to talk with you for a couple minutes today about creating high-quality clinical supervision. Why did I give this presentation this title? Well, partially because my talk today is hopefully just about active things that you can actually do in supervision. So trying to steer away from having kind of a theoretical conversation and really trying to bring in more practical ideas. And also I gave it this title just because I think catchy titles help us to remember things better. So I hope that's the case for all of you. In the spirit of this being a what can I do presentation, rather than giving a formal land acknowledgement, which has nicely already been done by the college, my first encouragement on something to do would be rather than to kind of stick with the standard language around acknowledging that you were on Treaty 6, 7, or 8 territory here in Alberta, to actually spend some time really going and reading the history of those treaties and reading the language of those treaties and really understanding specifically what you are acknowledging. I myself did not understand that for a long period of time. And when I did a deep dive, it was very interesting. So that's my first recommendation on what to do. Who am I and why am I talking about this? I would say my love of supervision probably borders on abnormal. It's my most favorite thing to talk about. My poor psychologist friends probably are sick of me talking about this, but my love of supervision actually started when I myself was a supervisee in grad school. Between master's and PhD, I actually had 12 different supervisors. I had lots of different supervisory experiences, and I was very privileged to have supervisory experiences that I would deem of high quality. But I've also been really steeped in supervision in my career. Like Troy said in my introduction there, I've supervised practicum students, provisionals. I've done supervision with developing supervisors. I am a supervision consultant and on the supervision review committee. So I love to work in this area. But my big passion for being here is because I fundamentally believe that in a profession where we are always working with people in some of their most vulnerable emotional moments, the risk for harm is very real. And I believe that supervision is one of, if not the most important stopgaps for that harm. So again, I'm going to say that again. In a profession where we are working with people in their most vulnerable emotional moments, the risk for harm is very real. And supervision is one of, if not the most important stopgaps for that harm. And so that's kind of my kind of big lifeblood behind this presentation. So if there's any there's any research, teachers out there or people that are really steeped in academics, of course, the first thing is going to be like, well, what do you mean by high quality supervision? So I'm just going to kind of give a bit of a template for high quality supervision as I'm talking about it. As Dr. Ellis outlined, there's lots of different definitions of supervision. If you were to do a deep dive into supervision literature, you'd probably see that there's six main researchers that come up over and over and over again. So for sure, Dr. Michael Ellis, as well as Ed Watkins. Then we have Fallender and Shafransky and Bernard and Goodyear. And I think if you were to turn to any of the works from any of those researchers, you'd find lovely definitions of supervision and incredible information about what supervision entails and how to do it well. I'm going to just go from the Fallender and Shafransky definition of supervision. I think it's very fitting. They talk a lot about supervision being a very distinct professional activity, which we talk about it in the same way with CAP. It's a collaborative interpersonal process. It has many different components, but ultimately supervision is there for the purpose of promoting and protecting the welfare of clients, of our profession, and of society at large. And if you do a big scan of the literature on supervision, you'll generally find that when students talk about having enjoyable supervision experiences or effective supervision experiences, there's kind of some common themes that come up. One, of course, is having a competent supervisor. We can't help folks be competent if we are not competent ourselves. Of course, we want supervision to be growth promoting. Supervisees should not end supervision in the same place that they started. And then, like Dr. Ellis said repeatedly today, and as we all know, the crux of things is really in having a really strong alliance between a supervisor and a supervisee, and that's fundamental. If you don't take away anything other than this from my presentation, the one thing I really, really want to reiterate, and I think this doubles down on what Dr. Ellis said, please do more in supervision than just sit and talk about cases. We know that that way of doing supervision is the easiest and the most affordable. However, we also know that that way of doing supervision is fraught with problems. Why? Well, there's many different reasons why it's fraught with problems. One is that we are relying on the observational and conceptual capacities of a student in training that doesn't know what they don't know. The other issue is that we have a lot of research that tells us that supervisees are not always truthful in supervision, and they don't always share information that would be deemed important. That's, of course, not always intentional. It's the reality of the dynamic that exists in that relationship. But it obviously creates problems when sticking with self-report supervision. And we have research that if you ask supervisees, they say that's the least helpful modality of supervision. So if you don't take anything else away, please take away, do more than just sitting and talking about cases with your supervisees. Okay, so what are some of the other things that we can do other than just sitting and talking about cases? So the first thing I'm going to say is look at your supervisee's written work, watch them work as much as humanly possible, and let them watch you work. Why do we want to look at their documentation? Why do we want to look at their case notes, their emails to their clients, obviously their assessment reports? Well, we want to get a good understanding of their professionalism and of the way that they view their clients. I think as psychologists, one of the things that we subtly are professional pattern finders. We're always looking for patterns in the lives of our clients and the things that our clients are doing. And we're doing the same as supervisors. So look for patterns for how your supervisees are working, how they're thinking about their clients, and all of that can be really well understood if you take the time to look at their actual documentation. We know that unfortunately, when we did our supervision survey, only about 36% of people are doing this. And so we need to be doing it a little bit more. And it's, of course, a great glimpse into the professionalism of students as well. Live observation and video recording. Why is this so important? Well, again, we have the research that tells us that students don't have the capacity to pick up on all of the important information in their sessions just by telling us about what happened. And so we've done some research in psychiatry where we talked about therapy with our students, and then we went on and looked at a video of the same session that we talked about. And what was found was that 50% of what supervisors deemed as important information was missed in the original dialogue, and 50% of what was shared was actually distorted or skewed. And so if we take the time to watch video or to do live observation, we have the opportunity to really get an accurate understanding of what our students are doing when they are working with their clients. Of course, live observation or video recording also helps us to bypass a lot of the biases that we know we have. We know we have memory biases. We know we have cognitive biases. So it helps us to get around some of those phenomena that exist in multiple aspects of our life. Obviously, you're going to get way more helpful information about the clients themselves if you're watching the work, and there's just going to be more access to that nonverbal information, which we know is fundamentally important, specifically in the context of counseling. And then let them watch you work. One of the most valuable experiences I had as a supervisee for sure was watching my supervisors work. Watching supervisors administer protocols for assessment is very important to understand how to adhere to standardization. Watching supervisors explain things, watching supervisors connect with clients in unique ways, all of these things are so fundamental to the learning of our students. We know the practice of psychology is an art and a science. The science can be a little easier to pick up from a textbook or from talking, but the art is something that's so important to see live and in person. All right. What's the next thing I want you to do? The next thing I want you to do is to be very, very, very intentional in the questions that you ask your students. So there's a whole kind of process of supervision called interpersonal process recall. That's a theory that goes back to the 70s, but we've been talking about it for a long time in the context of psychology. Interpersonal process recall originally is the idea of watching a tape with a student, sitting down, pausing, and asking very intentional questions about what's going on for the student at that time. I agree with Dr. Ellis. If you are going to invest in any supervision resource, I highly suggest that you invest in the Bernard and Goodyear textbook. It is expensive, but it is so worth it because there's such great material in it. And one of the best things they have in there, I believe it's in chapter 17, I want to say, or no, sorry, it is in chapter 8, is a whole list of questions that were born out of interpersonal process recall. And it is fantastic to have conversations with your students instead of in the vein of, what do you think you should do next with this client in this one situation? Okay, so how are you feeling? And I'm going to pause the conversation. I'm going to pause the tape and tell me how you were feeling right there. And what do you think your client was feeling? And, how does this compare to other feelings that you've had in sessions? Or what were you hoping the client was going to say in that particular moment? And really kind of doing a deep dive into what's going on there for the student. Or, what were you feeling in that moment? And how do you make sense of those feelings? What do those feelings really mean to you? And then when we ask good questions, we get really good information, which another thing I want you to do is read between the lines when your students are talking. So we have data that shows us that in supervision, about 97% of students admit to at some point intentionally withholding or lying about information in supervision. This is not because our students are bad people. This is because our students are concerned about evaluation. They're concerned about our opinion of them. They're concerned about the competency of their supervisors. So we need to read between the lines a little bit, and we get good data to do that if we ask good questions. So we wanna really pay attention to how self-aware are our students, how well are they assessing their own competency, what are they, how aware they are of their biases, of what's their worldview, how are they understanding change, and how are they conceptualizing change, how are they conceptualizing their clients. How ethically minded are they in the little things, not the big ethical dilemmas, but the little moments? How ethically minded are they? How professional are they coming across? Listen for what the student's case or theoretical orientation might be. So many students come to supervision and they say, my goal is to develop my theoretical orientation. And if you listen and how they're talking, they probably already have it. They just don't know what it's called. And so you can help to really suss that stuff out with your students if you just listen effectively and really read between the lines. Again, keep in mind, students don't know what they don't know, and it's on us to be the knower of more. And then what else do I want you to do? I want you to set up a contract with your students. Jeff talked a lot about that. Dr. Ellis talked a lot about that. I agree. I think contracting is such a fundamental part of a successful supervision relationship because it is the informed consent component. In my contracts, I write a whole series of things about myself, my approach to supervision, how many students I've supervised, the way that I work with clients. I have a very clear delineation of expectations that are fair for me and expectations that I would have of my students. I talk about evaluation and contracts. I talk about goals. What are their goals and what are they hoping to get out of our time together? I talk about how we can contact each other between supervision sessions. I talk about expectations around time together and modalities of supervision. So set the relationship up from the start for success by being very clear about all aspects of the relationship. What else do I want you to do? I want you to bathe that entire supervision relationship in feedback in every way possible. So feedback, of course, is going to be informal. Every supervision session should involve feedback in some capacity, whether it's feedback on videos, feedback on written work, feedback on how your students are conceptualizing cases. Feedback should be all over your supervision relationship. Feedback can be formal and informal. I really want to encourage you all to think about having evaluation that you create that's in addition to the CAP evaluation, that gives you some benchmarks that you are using to dialogue with your student about their work. CPA has wonderful competency descriptions in their accreditation documentation that you can utilize to create to create your own unique evaluation. You can use routine outcome monitoring as a way to drive feedback, so you can get your provisionals or your practicum students to be doing routine outcome monitoring with things like the SRS and the ORS to really, again, see patterns and to understand how your student is doing. And you should be getting feedback. You should be getting feedback about how the process is going. You can use quantitative, qualitative, informal, formal measures for that. And you should be getting feedback about your supervision from a supervisor as well. So Dr. Ellis talked about soup of soup. I'm not sure if I'm, cool enough to call it that, but getting supervision of supervision, I think is a really fundamental component to being successful as well. And then, of course, you're going to be doing teaching, modeling, and case consultation, which is inherent in the process. So that's all I have to say about supervision. I really want you to take away that supervision is so much more than just sitting and talking about cases. And if you ever want to talk about supervision, I'm more than happy to have a conversation with anybody at any time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erica. I really appreciate that. And it was really, really informative. A lot of positive comments have been about both presenters so far, both panelists, and we really appreciate your time to talk about what is quality supervision. I think that's there's a lot of great points. I'd now like to introduce our third panelist, and I'm very happy to welcome Ms. Brecken Tulloch. I'm sorry if I'm saying your last name right. That's correct? Great. And we're very grateful that we have somebody who can give us a perspective from the provisional perspective. And so Brecken is a registered provisional psychologist at Willow Psychology under the supervision of Dr. Sherry Antonucci and Michelle Merchant. She completed her master's in counseling psychology at the University of Lethbridge. Brecken has an undergraduate degree in education and has an experience working as a teacher in rural Alberta. She works with teens, adults, couples in private practice, and has completed training in emotionally focused therapy for individuals and couples. Welcome, Brecken, and really looking forward to what you have to share today.
Thank you, Troy. And as I share my screen, there we go. I want to start off by, did I just move that in front of? I want to start off by saying I'm here to continue the conversation on supervision from the perspective of a supervisee. Supervision has been a critical component of my professional growth as a provisional psychologist. And it's really created a space, a consistent space for my learning, support, and reflection on my work. Troy already introduced me, but I want to give a shout out to all the incredible supervisors that I've had the opportunity to learn from and grow with. My supervision journey began at the University of Alberta Counseling and Clinical Services with Becky and Maddie, and now I'm at Willow with Sherry and Michelle, so thank you. When creating this presentation, I really wanted to include parts that would be helpful for both supervisees and supervisors. So I'm starting today by looking at how supervisees can build a strong supervision alliance, which we know from the research is a critical component of successful supervision. So inevitably, there are going to be challenges to a strong supervision working alliance that include discrepancy between supervisor approach and supervisee level, unhelpful feedback, and of course, personal factors impacting performance. So to navigate these challenges, a few recommendations for supervisees are being transparent about your past experiences so that your supervisor can tailor supervision to your needs, collaborating with your supervisor to create short and long-term goals, and developing a plan with your supervisor to handle issues and challenges that may arise during supervision. If you feel like you are receiving feedback that is unhelpful, such as being really vague, ask for clarification or specific examples. If feedback is negative, request specific actions to improve your performance. You can also propose developing a supervision contract if you already don't have one. I know that's something that was talked about today. That includes regular progress reviews to keep things on track. Lastly, if you notice a decline in your performance due to personal factors, because we are human and things do happen in our lives, discuss it with your supervisor as soon as possible. If you're feeling overwhelmed, seek guidance from your supervisor on how to manage stress and time. I was able to lean on my supervisors and use them as a resource to navigate the challenges that inevitably come with being a psychologist. So something that was noted throughout all our presentations today is how important supervisee self-disclosure is. So I've included a few suggestions on what to disclose. Jeff earlier on the panel had excellent examples to add to the short list I have here. And also what increases and decreases supervisee self-disclosure. So what I have found helpful to disclose to my supervisors is reactions I'm having to clients, doubts about my own competence, stressors that are maybe impacting my clinical work, specific client treatment concerns, and of course, client safety concerns as well. Supervisees tend to disclose more when they feel that their supervisor creates a safe space for open communication. This can be done through modeling self-disclosure, through validation of a supervisee self-disclosure, and also respect for supervisee privacy and boundaries. It's also important, when I was doing some research for the presentation, for supervisors to clarify the benefits of self-disclosure, such as further development, support with a specific client or specific concern, and also more focused practice of a particular skill. On the flip side, under the dotted line, we can see that a weak supervisory relationship, negative beliefs about self-disclosure, and also a fear of repercussions can cause a supervisee to withhold critical information. So on this slide, I really wanted to highlight something that as a supervisee has been so helpful to me throughout my supervision journey. I have always been quite open with my supervisors, and I believe that's because they have modeled self-disclosure to me. My supervisors have used self-disclosure to normalize my experiences in what is a very challenging career that demands so much of us. Supervisor self-disclosure can also go a long way in reducing the differential between supervisor and supervisee, power differential, sorry. Supervisors who model accountability and self-reflection through self-disclosure not only strengthen the alliance, but promote supervisee growth. As a supervisee, it can be very daunting. We have 107 hours of supervision during our provisional hours that we have to make the most out of. So I've included here some potential uses, also from Jeff's presentation on the panel. He had a lot more other uses, and Erica touched on this as well. But some of the ones that I have written here and some that I've been able to practice in my supervision time is reviewing recorded sessions, live observations, role playing, reviewing client notes, sharing clinical experiences, reviewing transcripts, outcome monitoring, debriefing tough sessions, and written feedback, just to name a few. It has been really helpful, I guess, from my perspective, as this presentation is. Really, from what's been helpful for me is that when supervisors have asked what I need from our time together, which really fosters collaboration and supervision. When supervisors have asked for feedback on supervision, it's really opened the door for me to advocate for what I need, because this has changed throughout supervision. What I needed that first week of seeing clients at U of A 3 years ago in my very first practicum was very different from what I need now in my last months as a provisional psychologist. Given the variety of how supervision time can be used, there is one that I would like to highlight that has been reiterated throughout today. And to give a hint, Dr. Erica also thinks it's an important one, is reviewing recorded sessions. So to touch on it from the supervisee's perspective, it can be really painful to review recordings of ourselves. When a colleague reminded me today that our panel would be recorded and could be rewatched later, I cringed. But I included this slide as a reminder to myself and to other supervisees that on why it is helpful, because I get that it is really hard to share parts of sessions that we struggled with, and it can be so vulnerable to share these clips with our supervisors. It was great to hear today that I'm not alone in this experience from Dr. Michael's presentation and the polls, that there was so many provisionals that are regularly reviewing recordings in their sessions. So that's awesome to hear. But to just to remind myself of why we reviewing recorded sessions is helpful for supervisees is that it can increase self-awareness, self-observation, self-reflection, increase objectivity in assessing our own technique and identifying areas for improvement. I started to notice things that I wouldn't have been able to without the opportunity to watch my work. After reviewing recorded sessions continually with my supervisor and supervision, I've been able to see things that my supervisor has pointed out in real time and act on them in session. Reviewing recorded sessions helps in better assessment of treatment outcomes and identifying client improvement, while also allowing for supervisors to give more specific feedback on supervisee skills and also client treatment. I always cherish kind of the opportunity. I think it's so interesting to hear my supervisor's feedback on my sessions or where I went with it and where they would go with it and where I can improve. All of this to say, be brave and record or continue to record for so many of us that already are your sessions. I promise you it will be a benefit to both you and your clients. So this is the end of my presentation. I know I talked really fast. I hope you were able to take away something today as both a supervisee or a supervisor. Thank you so much to Kat for this opportunity, and hopefully one day I'll be able to give back to supervisees in the way that my wonderful supervisors have given to me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brecken. Really appreciate you providing that information and that perspective. I think it's so important that we were able to include a voice of someone who's at the stage that you're at, and to get that perspective. I think that was very helpful. Thank you. We're going to turn to our final panelist. So I'm happy to welcome Dr. Kevin Wallace. Dr. Wallace is Assistant Deputy Registrar and in the Professional Conduct Department at the College of Alberta Psychologists. He completed his master's degree and his PhD in counseling psychology at the University of Alberta, where his doctoral research focused on the qualities of highly effective therapists. Dr. Wallace came to the College of Alberta Psychologists from the University of Alberta, where he served for many years as a clinical supervisor in the Faculty of Education's Counseling Psychology Professional Training Program. For several years, he held the role of Director of Training for the Edmonton Cross Specialty Psychology Residency Program. Dr. Wallace has diverse experiences professionally, including providing counseling to individuals across the lifespan and conducting a range of formal assessment. He has also provided clinical supervision to well over 100 individuals, including graduate students, doctoral interns, and provisional psychologists. He has taught numerous graduate courses in the areas of counseling psychology, formal assessment, clinical supervision, and professional ethics. Dr. Wallace is familiar with professional practice issues in educational, public sector, and private practice settings. Over the past 15 years, Dr. Wallace has been actively involved in regulatory and guidance activities, previously serving on the Psychologists Association of Alberta's Board of Directors. He has also previously volunteered on several College of Alberta Psychologist committees, including the University Program Approvals Committee, the Oral Ethics Examination Committee, Supervision Review Committee, and the Practice Advisory Committee. I welcome Kevin, and I look forward to what Kevin has to say to us.
Thank you so much, Troy, and thank you, everyone. See if I can share this. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about common supervision concerns and complaints, and these are concerns that are brought to the attention of the college. So, as Troy mentioned, I'm Dr. Kevin Wallace, and I've been here at CAP now for just over a year and a half. And what I'd like to talk about is essentially what do we hear in the conduct department hear from people about common concerns or complaints. And I'm going to describe some of those common concerns, and then I'm going to discuss possible ways to minimize the chances of those concerns arising. It's my hope that these suggestions that I'm offering to you will enhance supervision experiences for both supervisors and supervisees alike. Okay, so to begin with, I think it's worth just going over some definitions. Who is a supervisor? Well, supervisor, according to CAP standards, is a person who oversees, a psychologist who oversees assistants, employees, provisionals, etc. So my talk today, it'll include all of those groups, but it's important to note that sometimes some of my tips refer more specifically to provisionals and supervisor provisional arrangements. Supervisee is a person who is providing services under the authority of a psychologist. So a supervisee is someone who's providing services. A client is a recipient of professional services according to the standards. So that means that a supervisee is in one way a provider and is in another way a client. And this is important because it means that a supervisee must adhere to the standards and that the standards and guidelines apply to the services they're receiving as well. Okay, so maybe it's worth noting that in the conduct department, I mentioned concerns and complaints, and we do get calls sometimes that we would call concerns. These are matters brought forward where the issue raised is one that has a really good chance of being rapidly resolved. Complaints are typically more formal. They engage the HPA process. They must be signed. Section 55 of the HPA outlines what CAP's options are when we receive a complaint. So we may seek a formal response. We still have the option to resolve. If it's available, investigations, expert opinions, referrals to tribunals, and dismissals are all possible outcomes. And where do these complaints and concerns come from? They come from sometimes a client, so that is the client of the provisional psychologist. They may have a complaint or concern about the services they're receiving. They may raise questions about the provisional, or they may even raise questions about the supervisor. An employer may call us with a concern or complaint about a provisional. A provisional psychologist may call us with a concern or complaint about their supervisor. And similarly, a supervisor may even contact us about a concern or complaint they have about a provisional. To go through these, what I think are common areas of concern, I've grouped them into three categories. The first I call missing the details. And this is a little bit like following or adhering to the rules. The second is incomplete supervision tasks. And this to me is about doing the tasks of supervision and the work within supervision. The third category is conflicts of interest. So missing the details, and this is really paying attention to the trees. The first of these, a common issue that arises is that a provisional psychologist is practicing outside of Alberta without being registered in that jurisdiction. And for situations like this, my tip is to pay very close attention to the rules around jurisdictional boundaries. That is to say, provisionals should only be practicing where they are licensed to do so. Sometimes we get queries about being a certified Canadian counselor, and being a certified Canadian counselor, in addition to being a registered provisional psychologist, does not mean that you're permitted to practice outside of Alberta without being registered in that jurisdiction. The HPA and the standards set out that the college regulates all within scope activities of psychologists. Another that's raised sometimes is practicing solo. Provisional psychologists who may not be fully adhering to the standards of supervision by practicing solo. Here, what we recommend is that both supervisor and supervisee work together to structure the supervision setting so that a provisional psychologist works with other regulated health professionals a majority of the time. That's the specific language used in the CAP FAQs. It's best practice from our perspective that at least one other regulated health professional that you're working with is a psychologist. And this is especially true early career when an early career psychologist is socializing into the profession. Competence is another one that comes up sometimes, and there's a number of ways in which competence concerns can be raised. It could be concerns about the supervisor's competence to supervise broadly. It could be their competence to supervise in a particular domain. It could be that there's concerns about a supervisee who lacks competence to engage in a particular service. So for formal or forensic assessment could be examples. Here, the tips I offer is that supervisors should carefully, for their own, for themselves, review their own competence to supervise and ensure that they can demonstrate their competence and that it was attained through education, training, and supervised experience, ideally. Limit supervision to only areas for which you are competent yourself to practice. For supervisees and supervisors working with those supervisees, it's important that they evaluate their base competency before engaging in any particular specific area of practice. And another one that's been mentioned a little bit before earlier today by Dr. Ellis is adherence to supervision ratios. So in this instance, it could be that there's concerns raised that there's a failure of the supervisee-supervisor dyad to adhere to supervision ratios and other supervision requirements. So that requirement, for example, for 25% face-to-face on-site supervision, or for there to be sufficient one-to-one supervision versus group supervision. Supervisors and supervisees together can carefully plan how supervision meetings will adhere to the required ratios, and both are responsible for ensuring the ratios are met. Okay, so the next one is a grouping or theme of concerns I describe as incomplete supervision tasks, and this is about doing the work of supervision. The first of these that I'll describe is informed consent for supervision, which I know has been discussed somewhat today. At issue is that informed consent for supervision perhaps has not been fully obtained. Some aspects of informed consent have not been sufficiently covered. Given that the supervisee is a client or recipient of services, standard 3.5, all 1 through 12 apply. So it's important to carefully obtain informed consent for supervision, discussing things like fees, costs, expectations for supervision, expectations of the supervisee in a workplace, etc. And the informed consent can be incorporated into a supervision contract, and so that's totally fine. But it is always important to have a supervision contract in place, from our view, before engaging in supervision. Continuity of care can be a concern sometimes, and it could be that we get a concern brought forward that a supervisee is insufficiently supported during a supervisor absence, or that a client experiences a disruption of service if a supervision agreement ends prematurely or supervisee changes work locations or something. So tips here: plan for absences of supervisors, ensure that there's coverage in place. Ensure that disruptions to client care are minimized, especially if a supervision agreement is terminated. We want to strive to respect client autonomy when there's a sudden termination of supervision. Record keeping and supervision comes up from time to time. Supervisors and supervisees, the issue would be that supervisors and/or supervisees have not kept adequate records of supervision. It could be that the supervision log is not up to date, or that the supervisor and supervisee do not agree about that log. The supervision clinical file is incomplete or missing. There can be disputes regarding hours. And the tips I suggest here is to prioritize record keeping so that records, including the clinical file and supervision logs, are complete and up to date. With respect to supervision logs, I recommend that the supervisor and supervisee frequently sign those logs, perhaps bi-weekly or at each in-person meeting. That limits the chance that there's a dispute about hours down the road. And expressing opinions comes up too. And in this case, what I'm referring mainly to is the opinions expressed by the supervisor about the supervisee in a mid or final evaluation. As with any expression of opinions, it's important that those opinions adhere to the standards of practice. And so it's important that my tip here is that supervisors recognize that evaluation is both formative and summative. Formative evaluations should be taking place regularly, so there are really no surprises when a summative evaluation is prepared. And ensure that opinions are supportable, that there's sufficient knowledge and evidence for the opinions provided, minimizing bias. As well, it's important that evaluations be completed on time. And then I just added this little slide here, which is a reminder to all of our members, those practicing clinical supervision and otherwise, that expressing opinions without sufficient professional contact remains one of our largest concern and complaint areas. So from all of us in professional conduct, important bonus tip here: do not express opinions about someone you've never met without substantial contact unless otherwise permitted by the standards. It's just an important caution for all members. Now, the last category here is real or perceived conflicts of interest, and this is about balance. One of the more common issues here is that a supervisee may raise concerns that the business interests of the supervisor have been placed ahead of the interests of the provisional. For example, it could be pressure to accept referrals, pressure around billing, sales, pressure to utilize specific approaches. Here, we recommend that supervisors, and I think Dr. Ellis touched on this too, be alert to real or perceived conflicts of interest and take steps to minimize conflict of interest and maximize objectivity. Avoid placing business interests ahead of the interests of the supervisee or the client. And similarly, sometimes where there's multiple supervisors, primaries and secondaries, it could be that there is a concern that there's a lack of collaborative care among multiple supervisors. Collaborative practice is set out in standard 15.1. So supervisors that are working together to provide supervision to a supervisee should keep collaborative practice in mind and ensure that they're demonstrating objectivity and avoiding bias towards each other and against the supervisee. So this is my little grouping. This is just Kevin's themes based on Kevin's overview of common concerns that arise. Missing the details, so really important, pay attention to the details within the supervision standards in particular. Incomplete supervision tasks, really doing the work of supervision is critical, and avoiding conflicts of interest. So here's my core messages. And my core tips is really just to attend to the rules, do the work of supervision carefully, and try your best to avoid and minimize conflict of interest. And I think one final tip that I'll bring up that I saw in the CPA guidelines around supervision is that keep in mind it's important that both supervisors and supervisees treat each other with respect, courtesy, and understanding. And I do believe that if that is done, if conflicts are addressed in open, honest, and beneficial ways, many concerns will never rise to the level of complaints, and they may never even come to us as concerns at all. That's that one there, sorry. So that's what I've got to say about common concerns or complaints that come to the college. I hope this has been beneficial to our members, supervisors, and supervisees alike, and that some of these tips may help you have more positive supervisory relationships.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I appreciate you and all the other panel members. I'd like to now invite all the panel members to make themselves visible. And maybe, Kevin, if you can stop screen sharing, that would be terrific. We've been receiving a lot of great commentary and questions from participants. So we have a few minutes left to try to address some of the questions that have been coming forward. And so my first question coming from our participants, I'll direct first to you, Jeff, although others may wish to participate and chime in on this. And this question relates to the tensions of being both employer and supervisor, and your thoughts about this sort of dual relationship that often occurs. And this was directed for Jeff, so I'm going to put it to Jeff first. And then if another of the panelists would like to chime in about how their perspective on that, we'll leave some time for that.
Thanks, Troy. Dr. Ellis said something that a very practical suggestion that I hadn't heard before, which was don't do clinical and administrative supervision in the same meeting. Made a lot of sense. There's some research that says, and I can dig out the reference, that, okay, just to qualify this, there's not a lot of research on this. There's two studies, I think, by the same person who say that supervisees don't seem to mind. It depends on the supervisor. It depends on the nature of the interactions and relationship with the supervisor. So basically, to put it bluntly, if the supervisor is a jerk, it's not going to work, right? And if the supervisor can develop a relationship with the provisional or with the supervisee, where they feel supported and where they feel understood and heard, the research that's out there seems to say that the supervisee doesn't mind one way or the other.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Would anyone else like
that with performance appraisal and stuff like that? But
absolutely. Would anyone else on the panel like to provide a perspective on that particular issue? Erica.
Yeah, I think one of the key things is again, it comes back to kind of setting up the relationship for success. And I think one of the things that you can be really clear and transparent about if that dual role is unavoidable is that you can talk about the same way that you would talk about how you're going to do remediation with a student. You can say, okay, this is how we would do remediation in the clinical context, and this is how we would do any type of remediation in the employment context, and just naming that conflict right from the start and really putting on the table what all the possible risks of that are going to be or foreseeable risks of that. And then having a very clear kind of articulation of exactly how you're going to manage those foreseeable risks.
Excellent. Would anyone else like to offer a perspective on that question, or can we move to the next one? Okay, hearing none, I will move on to the next question. This one I will address to you, Brecken. Brecken, the question I have relates to your comments about the perceived nervousness, difficulty in receiving live supervision, and just a thought of, the question is really to sort of tell us what helped you to overcome that general tendency and resistance and even nervousness about having to get directly observed in some way, either video or live. What helped you with that?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think what really helped me is that it was there from the start. At U of A, at the clinic counseling and clinical services, I was very fortunate to have the model where I would 1 week get to observe my supervisor, and then we would meet, and then the next week I would be observed by my supervisor. So I think it was integral throughout my entire journey. When I transitioned into private practice for my provisional hours, recording sessions was very much a part of the process. I think just the warm and open kind of environment that my supervisors provided me allowed me kind of the opportunity to show the tough stuff or the stuff that I'm struggling with. But I think also to touch on getting to observe my supervisor made a big difference, right? Because I got to see both of them work, right? And I got to kind of see that it isn't always a polished start to finish, right? And that I can fumble too.
Excellent. Thanks so much for that response. I don't know if anyone else wanted to chime in about that in ways that they, as a supervisor, have helped to make their supervisee feel comfortable with live or other observation. Is any other comments anyone wants to make?
I think if I may, in the supervision that I did, one of the things I would suggest is the supervisee have some degree of control over what's shared sometimes. So bringing in video clips if you're able to record sessions, and then having choice about what's shown and when, and pause here, skip this part, move ahead. That level of control I think does also reduce anxiety if it's possible.
Yeah. Excellent. A related question is there are some that are indicating that there's organizational barriers to videotaping, and they're wondering what solutions the panelists might have for problem solving when there is an organization that may be resistant to the idea of recording sessions. Is there anybody who would like to chime in? I'm not going to direct this to anyone specifically, but if I'm open to hearing from any of you. Erica?
I can say that we definitely encountered derivatives of this at the U of A for sure. In big organizations, there's always fears around the legal risks of things. So you have to get to the root of what those fears are and talk to the right people. So if that means going to the highest possible person that you can reach and educating them to then have a conversation with the people that are in charge of your liability insurance, like you have to just have all the right players like in a conversation and have really concise but important education for what exactly you are doing and the stopgaps that you are going to put in place to ensure that the risk for harm is minimized. So just if you're videoing, number one, the cost is not high. Technology is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But also just be really clear on how you are going to store and maintain and get informed consent for and document and like have all your bases covered, then bring the argument to the individuals and make sure that all the people that are literally paid to worry, which is the liability folks, that you can convince them. But you just have to have the right players in the room, and it is possible for sure.
Thank you. Really appreciate those comments. Any others? Jeff?
I'm going to add to that. The people who have the power to permit that, if that's a problem, this is about quality assurance, and this is about assuring patient safety. So that's one of the biggest arguments. The other thing is that I think we can encourage our supervisees to video or live supervision. And I think the way they ask clients is really important. So sometimes I talk to my provisionals about, like, don't do it like you're in grade 10 in calm class, asking if you can interview your next door neighbor about it, what it's like to be an accountant. And it's an assignment for school. This is, I'm a provisional psychologist, or I'm a practicum student. I'm still learning. And you have to, this has to be true if you say this. I record as much as I possibly can, or I have my supervisor observe me as much as I possibly can. This is not about you. This is about us doing our best to provide you with the best possible service. So I encourage my folks to ask confidently, not coercively. And in a previous iteration in my private practice career, I was having full fee clients who would consent to being recorded. And that was in the olden days when there was a big camera mounted on the wall and a VHS recorder underneath the desk. Because I just said, this is about me getting better at what I do. This is how I can serve you better. So with most folks, I mean, there are some populations and some individuals for whom that's going to be really tough. But yeah. So anyways, that's my my take on that one.
Great. Thank you for that. This next question I'm going to direct to you, Kevin. There was some question about CAP's policies on anonymous complaints in relation to principles of natural justice. And their query is, are we going to why do we persist in asking for complaints not to be anonymous? And I don't know if you could answer that question.
Well, I think I know you could answer this question a whole lot better and more eloquently than I could, Troy, having been in the conduct department for quite some years. But essentially, it is a requirement of the HPA that that is my understanding is that concerns and complaints must be assigned. It is a quasi-judicial process similar to a civil action against someone, and the person defending themselves has a right to know who's filed the complaint, just like they would have a right to know who's filed the civil suit against them. Not that the complainant is filing a civil suit, but they're part of it. And so for those reasons, we cannot accept anonymous concerns and submissions. Yeah, I don't know if you would add anything, Troy, but that's my.
Yeah, it would be a rare exception. I mean, it's generally true. It's a principle of natural justice that anonymity can't be allowed. Principle of natural justice is to know your accuser. That's an essential principle. You can give proper answers, so you know where the concern is coming from. And our role is, in fairness, is to hear both sides and to be able to render a decision. And so you have to be able to be in contact with both parties and when a concern arises. So that is, so you answered it really well. Now, the next question I'm going to direct to all of you, but maybe we can take turns. And there was some debate in the chat around, or even confusion, if you will, around the role or advisability of using self-disclosure in the supervision. Some had noted that it's generally not advisable, in sort of managing boundaries with clients. What would you say is the appropriate role of or benefit potentially, and where would it be not advisable to use self-disclosure? And I'll start with Brecken, actually, I see you nodding, so maybe you can start with that, and then we'll go Erica. I think you were ready to talk to this, and then anyone else after that.
Erica, if you want to go, I see that you have something to say and I can follow you.
Sure, no problem. I think the response to this it would be very in keeping with kind of perspectives on self-disclosure in the context of therapy as well. The biggest question is, what's the purpose, right? And so have I used self-disclosure in my supervision? Absolutely. But that was meant for the purpose of normalizing experiences. That was meant for the purpose of educating that was not at any time meant for the purpose to develop friendship or to seek any type of emotional validation or support from my supervisees. I think it's so important to remember that our supervisees are the vulnerable ones in the relationship. And so any use of self-disclosure would really have to be bent or couched on the why. Why are we doing it, and what's the purpose of bringing it in?
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Erica. And to touch on kind of, I know that was brought up after my presentation. And I think what really prompted me in talking about supervisor self-disclosure is because it was helpful to normalize some of the experiences of being really new and doubting my competence or struggling with clients. And when supervisors were able to kind of share, like, yeah, like this is a hard client, or I've had clients, that I've struggled with as well. I think is the use of self-disclosure by my supervisor that has been really helpful for me.
Excellent. Thank you. If it's okay, unless someone wanted to answer that as well, I will move on to the next question, which is, there's someone asking about what if we feel as a provisional or as a supervisee that we're experiencing harmful supervision and in the context of psychology, what would be the advice to them in terms of steps they might take to respond to that? And perhaps we could start with you, Jeff, since and then maybe Kevin could give the sort of what the college would generally advise in terms of if you got us involved. But maybe start with you, Jeff, on that question.
Well, the first step that just comes to mind is connecting with one of CAP's supervision consultants. So there's a half a dozen of us who do that, and I think we've have been at least okay at helping folks resolve difficulties. As far as I know, most of the folks, if I just look at the names and kind of my experience with them, most of the folks are actually skilled, also knowledgeable about legal issues. They've done work in the family law arena, so they're mindful of dispute resolution processes, and they're mindful of the kinds of things that might trip us up in that respect. So that's always the first step. And then if it's unresolvable, there's a couple times when I think I've assisted folks to make a graceful exit. And I guess it depends on how egregious the behavior is and whether it's unintentional. I think it's possible to be harmful, but unintentionally. And then I guess if the behavior is egregious, then maybe that's where Kevin and Troy come in. I think that would be an extreme situation. Yeah.
Yeah, if I might as well jump in. So I think it really does depend when we're talking about harmful supervision, as was described by Dr. Ellis. There's a range of what could be in there, and some of the things that are subsumed under harmful supervision may well be violations of standards. They may well be very serious, and or they may be things that can be problem solved and resolved. And I know that we talked about that from the college's perspective, we can't proceed with a complaint or concern anonymously, but receiving a call in conduct, if you were to call us and speak to us, that doesn't automatically mean that we're going to take action. We get a number of calls that are just inquiries that we will end up talking to somebody. So I guess what I'm saying here is a provisional could contact professional conduct, and just ask to speak to somebody, and then we'll talk with you about your concern and try to understand it, engage it, and then explore the possibilities. If it is very serious, we'll talk about options. If it's possibly resolvable, we'll talk about ways that the college may be able to help, or we may even, point you in the direction of the PAA advisors, supervisory advisors. But it really does depend, I think, on what we're talking about with harmful, because we do want the egregious, serious, harmful supervision, violation of standards level stuff our job is to protect the public, and that includes provisional psychologists. So we want to hear about that.
Excellent. Can you all hear me still? I had to switch out of my microphone. My battery died. I've been online all day with my same microphone, so hopefully you can all hear me fine. Appreciate those answers. There was some, this one's directed to you, Jeff. You had mentioned competency profiles in your presentation, and someone was puzzled, asked you to clarify what you mean by a competency profile.
Yeah. There's some really significant work by Rudolpha and colleagues, and it's been built on by that, about a model of competency for psychologists that actually has time benchmarks. So in all the different areas of practice, like assessment and evaluation, interventions, research, administration, ethics and standards, there's specific benchmarks that are that are time bound. So that's I can throw a reference up in the chat in a sec. The other thing is that now these aren't exactly on point, but for counseling psychologists, they could be very useful. The CRPO, College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario, has an entry to practice competency profile, and the BC Association for Clinical Counselors do as well. And a good part of, like, I would just guess about 80% or maybe more is going to be valid for folks who are doing mainly interventions. It doesn't have anything for formal assessment. Another competency profile is NASP, National Association of School Psychologists. So some of these professional associations have developed these things. They can be very useful, and they might not be able to be used right off the rack, but and they're based on sort of broad professional consensus.
Thanks, Jeff, for that. The next question is about how do we train the competency of supervision with a supervisee? And so I'll direct this one first to Erica, and maybe Kevin could chime in, because this sort of is like, what's the role and proper role of helping a new supervisee possibly learn supervision? Jeff, you could probably chime in on this for sure too. And even Brecken, you might have a perspective on what would help you as a new provisional, if you were going to think about supervising in 5 years once you're registered. So there's all of you have a potential to answer, like, what's the best way to train someone to do supervision?
That's such a good question. I think again, if we think about what's the best way to train a therapist to do therapy, we train them in 1,000 different ways, right? We get them to read, we get them to try it, we give them tons of feedback, we get them to record doing it, and it's kind of the same. So when we did supervision at the U of A, when we were doing this, we would have supervision seminars where we would literally sit down with our provisionals and we would teach them the theory of supervision. We would have them practice supervision. So we'd have doctoral residents practicing supervision with master's practicum students. We would then do supervision of that supervision with a senior psychologist. We would give them the opportunity to sit down with each other and do peer supervision of that supervision. And there would just be feedback in all of those domains. So the best way to do it is to to do it in as many ways as you can access.
Thanks, Erica. Anyone next?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great answer, Erica, and I would wholeheartedly agree with all of that. I think when it depends on the level of the person being trained. So if the person's a graduate student, they're not going to be in a position where they'll get experience supervising, perhaps, but they sometimes get the opportunity to supervise or provide support to junior students. And it sort of starts to get like the training wheels of supervision going. At later stages, they might, a doctoral student might supervise a master's student, and then a provisional might sort of provide support to a practicum student. and so on. So I guess it's just about finding the opportunities to get supervision at an appropriate level for you at the time. And because I do firmly believe that clinical supervision is like any competency developed through education, having some training, and then supervised practice. Those three things combined.
Yeah, the AMFT, starting back in the 70s, led the way on this, developing their approved supervisor credential, which required a course, a supervision philosophy paper, it still does require, and 36 hours of supervision. So, I mean, that's a model, that's a benchmark for me. I recognize that not everybody's going to do that. Not everybody who's supervising provisionals is going to do that. I think we have to be careful about, like several people on the chat have mentioned, deterring supervisors, potential supervisors or provisionals, and the supply of supervisors is getting pretty thin. Several people have mentioned that they turn people away, and so do I. So there's that, and there's also, we shouldn't just let anybody, but we have to be very mindful of whether we're prepared to do it, right? So I'm not saying everybody needs 36 hours of supervised, like eyes-on supervisory practice, but it's something to think about.
Thank you. Brecken, do you have a perspective on what you think would be really helpful for you as a supervisee to learn about supervision?
Thank you. I think just listening to what has been said, I do one day would love to be in the role of a supervisor, and I would be seeking out training and seeking out a supervisor and recording my supervision sessions in a very similar, or not in a similar way to kind of I'm trying to develop as a provisional right now.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for all those perspectives. I've got a number of other questions. Of course, they're coming fast and furious to some extent. I'm sorry again if I'm missing anybody, as I'm trying my best to get to those. There was a question for the panel in terms of a provisional who runs their own practice. Of course, we have a restriction on solo practices, and so they're not allowed to have run their own practice by themselves. But I wonder if people would offer sort of a principle-based sort of perspective on what they think about a provisional psychologist running a practice that they're in charge of, and what their thoughts are about that. And this isn't directed at anyone specifically, so if whoever wants to chime in is welcome to.
I mean, I think I'll jump in, and it's just from a principal perspective, it's putting the provisional at a lot of risk. There's not a lot of support around. There's a lot of complexity to being in practice, and having supports around nearby, I think is just critical to minimizing risk, and also further to even just developing the competence and the skills needed.
Any other perspectives?
It's tricky these days. We lived through, a year and a half of almost exclusively online virtual practice. Social isolation can be a problem, as Kevin said. In fact, having other regulated health professionals around, I've said this sometimes isn't that helpful if you're in with a chiropractor and a massage therapist who aren't providing proper space with, like soundproofing or appropriate admin support that knows how to deal with confidentiality, the kind of confidentiality that we need. So, there's some ways to support provisionals. We've supported them to advocate for different kinds of infrastructure at their practices where they've been in with other regulated health professionals who aren't mental health professionals. But it's tough. Social isolation can be really problematic.
Yeah.
Uh, one of the things that I would just say, for myself, I've been registered as a psychologist for just over 10 years, and with my business partner, Dr. Sean Barford, we run a practice together in Edmonton, and it's still very intimidating, even being 10 years into this. And because Kevin's right, like there's a lot that that you have to think about, and I go back to what I said in my presentation, which is when you're a student, or sorry, I call provisional students because that was just the language I use at the university. But when you're a student, you don't know what you don't know. And there's so many little things that you don't realize you don't know. But I just think about things like creating consent forms and making sure that those are, accurate, and having file like what will happen if something happened to you as the practice owner, who would take the files and who's responsible for them, and file management and confidentiality management, and management if you're doing assessment and counseling in the same practice. How are we sharing information? And there's so many nuances within it. And it's just hard when you don't know. And one of the things that I will also say is, being a little bit advanced in the profession, I think that we kind of grow in our cohorts in the profession. So a lot of my people that I talk about psychology to are people that have also been registered for 10 to 15 years. And so that's really helpful. But I think if you're provisionals and your immediate psychology community is a lot of other provisionals, there's also not the chance to maybe have the same level of support that you might if you've registered and have been doing this for a little while.
Thank you for all that. Brecken, the question I put to you and related to that is, if you thought about the idea of running your own practice someday, how would you feel about that, and what would go through your mind in thinking about that as a provisional? Like, what would you think about that idea, and what would you find helpful in your journey as a provisional, in thinking about that as a possibility down the road?
For sure. First of all, I will say when that question was posed, a feeling of panic kind of came over me. I feel very grateful to be in a group practice where these are things that I'm not having to figure out on my own. I can't imagine having to be in the position of starting a private practice as a provisional. There's so much I'm learning, and I'm really trying to focus on the competencies that I'm developing. And I think having to think of policies and I don't even know. As Erica said, all the things I don't even know, or I know that I don't know, would be such a added challenge that I'm not ready for, nor do I want to go out on my own. But I think, as Erica said as well, maybe as things progress and as my cohort of people, I think would be someone to lean on if that was something down the road I wanted to take on as an endeavor or challenge.
Yeah, Troy, I mean, and I think it's just worth emphasizing that never mind the principle aside, it is prohibited. And it's prohibited for a reason, to protect the public. So I just think it's really important to emphasize the point that we do get concerns and complaints about members, provisionals who are in solo settings, and that is in direct violation of the standards for supervision. So.
That's a very good point. And there's a reason for anything that became a standard is usually because of a public protection concern. It may not necessarily be about something in the literature or evidence-based practice always, but there could be a strong link to a public protection need for something to exist. The next question, I am going.
Sorry,
to
can I just pop in on Kevin's point? It's the gray ones, the gray areas. So like what Kevin just described is prohibited. Absolutely. It's the gray ones that can be problematic, right? Like I mentioned a psychologist practicing with other regulated health professionals who don't know diddly about what we do, really. Or private practices where there's 5 psychologists, but you're all ships passing in the night. Or where you're affiliated with a private practice and you're doing half your work from your basement home office, right? So those are tricky. Those aren't prohibited, but they're tricky. So I just encourage people to get the support they need.
Yeah. Those are great points. I actually, authored an article, and there was a whole issue on business practice in the CAP Monitor, and I think it was in issue 62, I think. And the piece that I authored was about just asking all the self-reflective questions you should contemplate before you even begin the process of running your practice or operating practice. I think it's helpful to be mindful and reflective practitioners on any of these kind of choices because of those tricky things. And no matter what type of business or other type of relationship we get into, I think it's a wise course to think carefully and answer those questions beforehand. Otherwise, you can run into trouble at various stages. This next question, and we're getting to 10 after 4, and I think the latest we'll go is 4:30 today. I think that's what I have on my agenda. So as long as that's everyone's good to go to there, we'll do that. But the next question is about barriers to supervision. We've found in our supervision review committee this question as well as why don't people want to do supervision, or why is there maybe a perception of a barrier to doing that, either through organization or through our own feelings about it, or just the difficulties or the hassle factor or perception of what it means to take on a supervisee. And so my question is actually more to put that on its head by asking each of you to answer this question. Why do you love supervision? And I don't know, want to start with that, but that's, it's to address the answer to the question, why is there barriers? I think it's helpful to articulate why you particularly love supervision, or even have loved the experience of being supervised in the past. And when you've experienced excellence, what is it about that? So any one of you can answer this question, I'm sure, but I don't know who wants to go first, and maybe I'll pick on Erica.
Sure. I don't know if my thoughts are totally well developed, but I'll try. There's lots of reasons why I love supervision. I love having the opportunity for teaching and mentorship, and think that personally, that's just an incredibly fulfilling role to play in anybody's life in any capacity. But I also love it because I feel very protective of our profession. I think that we have the potential to do really amazing things. And I also think that we have the potential to do harmful things. And I'm very protective of us being held by society at large in the vein of a group of helpful individuals. And I really just believe that that's so important. And I also love supervision because I think it's a really beautiful way to advance the profession and a way to give back. Like I mentioned in my presentation, I had beautiful supervision experiences. Like I for as long as I'm a psychologist, I will draw on those experiences and feel grateful for them. And if I can offer that to anybody, what I received, I think that's fantastic. And I think it's a very privileged position to be with somebody in such a vulnerable time of their career development, and to have any impact on that, I think has the potential to be so fulfilling and rewarding. So that's my underdeveloped thoughts, but I might have more. I don't know.
Who wants to go next?
Well, everything Erica said. And I'm getting to the point in my career stage where I'm just so proud of the people that I've come into contact with, and it's like they're remarkable people. Some of them, and if you're out there, I'm talking about you. Remarkable people, and I've just been it's a privilege to just be like a little part of their development and their really outstanding contributions to our field. So. Yeah, it's getting a bit verklempt.
But who wants to go next? It looks like Brecken, you're
I
ready
can
to go.
go.
What
Yeah.
do you say about this question?
Yeah, I feel so grateful. I have had nothing but excellent supervision. Um, to have a space, like a consistent space where I can show up with whatever I have, an opportunity to learn and grow and reflect and be supported, is amazing. And I'm so grateful. And as I near the end of my provisional hours, I'm sad, but also know that I am definitely not done with supervision. And I will be seeking consultation to support my work.
Thanks, Brecken. And Kevin.
Yeah, I had a lot of opportunity to supervise, and I started doing it early career, so that was kind of unusual in my circumstances, just where I landed. And I one thing I think about clinical supervision is that it is challenging, and I like a challenge. I enjoy a challenge, and because it's complex, it's new, it's got so much growth and renewal in it. It is what renews the profession, and I just love that. Like it's like spring all the time. But then you're also trying to bring to the supervisees the wisdom that you might have of previous springs and how to plant gardens and help them grow. So I the challenge, the renewal, the learning, the growing, the reflecting, just like Brecken mentioned, I love all those things and have enjoyed that in my years of supervision.
Thanks all for that. And my own answer to that question is the same, very similar. But I'd add one thing. I was taught it's a professional expectation to give back to your profession, to supervise. And so it was almost presented as a professional obligation to help the next generation once you're at that point of where you've had enough experience, training, and time to give back. And now, of course, we prefer that to be also with supervision and training and education and preparation so that you're ready for that task. But the most rewarding thing for me is the relationships that you formed, and sometimes forever relationships that are, they move from provisional supervisee to eventually colleague and possibly forever friend. And that's an interesting progression of relationship in where you're in this different type of relationships. And it's one of those weirdnesses, and people have talked about the weirdness of the professional business relationship, that relationship. Some are troubled more by that, even though it's actually it's permitted. And we have to remind ourselves that psychologists often play and have to navigate shifting of multiple professional roles. This can happen with clients. I mean, you might see individuals and then bring in a spouse and shift now to a couple work or vice versa. And that requires careful navigation. There's a lot of things in this, and this is actually a topic that we're actually applying our mind to at CAP around what's the advice on navigating these sorts of professional roles. And we're not ready with that new guideline, but we're updating a guideline. So it's not just about assessment or treatment, it's about navigating all the professional roles, including supervision, and facing those kinds of questions. So that was just something I thought I'd chime in a little bit to add. Now, there's been a lot of things popping up in the question and answer and the chat around the troubling issue of fees and money. And when I premised this question that we said about why you love it, it's also was couched in the barriers to supervision or people choosing to be supervisors. And it might be even a troubling topic in general, and it can often be associated even with concerns around harmful or exploitive types of practices. The topic of what's fair and now CAP doesn't post fee structures or expectations on this, but I'm wondering if I could pose this sort of question to each of the panelists about what would your thoughts be around the idea of fairness in this. And this is a tricky issue, so I recognize this is potentially a landmine issue to step in on. But what would you say are some of the things that have helped guide how you navigate this particular issue? And I don't know who wants to go first. Maybe nobody wants to talk about fees.
Yeah, I will. my spouse and I jointly supervise. She's a registered psychologist as well. We jointly supervise some folks. Um, uh, I we're not doing it for the money, really. We get paid. We have a flat fee. That's a little bit less than the hourly rate for 107 hours of supervision. There's 2 of us who do it, so then it's a little bit less than half the hourly rate, full fee rate. And we enjoy doing it together. But but within the context of the flat fee, we I think we offer a lot of I don't think it, I'll just put it this way. I don't think it pays to be a bean counter in terms of hours, money, billables. And I think if you can't, I think it requires a bit of generosity. And that might be easy for me to say because I've had a salaried academic job for the last several years, but I think there's many areas in which we deserve to get well paid. And I'm not saying we should be not paid or poorly paid for this, but I think that this might be an area in which generosity and flexibility are warranted.
Any other comments about this idea? And the principle here is, of course, avoiding harmful supervision and exploitation is certainly something that we would say is important in considering the answer to any kind of questions around compensation. It can become a conflict of interest, personal gain versus a fair living wage for a provisional, right? So, what's fair is often a difficult question to answer, and I think it's important that we think about that reflectively as a profession in terms of this. And there's a lot of different ways people do this and a lot of different models for what's fair in compensating somebody for the work they're doing, and what's fair, and that includes the supervisor, right? So anyway, any other comments about that from any of the panelists?
I mean, it is a professional service, and with any professional service, there's responsibility, there's liability, there's, that a supervisor is taking on. So I think, from my perspective, if you can take on professional services that include a lot of responsibility and liability and have a flexible rate, a lower rate, it's possible to do that. But if you're doing a lot of it, it could be difficult to do that. I think the only comment I would really have is that I think it's really important that fees and fee structures and any kinds of agreements that are made be carefully discussed and collaboratively arrived at as much as possible. So that it's all about informed consent. And so yeah, Jeff, you're.
I'm reading some of the chat
Oh,
comments.
okay. That
Sorry,
was what I did. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I would think is that just attend to the informed consent aspect of fees very, very carefully. It's a big agreement. Yep.
Thank you, Kevin. We'll move on from that one. Some have asked about examples of how you'd handle correction or remediation, and maybe you can even go to the place of how you've received correction or remediation and what made that okay or not okay. But people are looking for ideas about when how do you get to a place where you identify someone as needing either correction and or remediation in supervision, and what are your recommendations around best practices? So anybody want to start with this? I don't know who's next on the docket. Erica?
Yeah, I can start with this. One thing I will say, which might just be a helpful resource, is if you go into any doctoral residency program, will have a a program guide that's required to be on their website. And typically part of that program guide is going to be a declaration of how remediation occurs. So you can certainly, borrow with pride some of those ideas, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel there. And there's very clear kind of remediation steps. But I think with remediation is always going to be, it's a multi-step process, right? So it's identifying the issue informally and discussing like how the student might be able to rectify that issue, whether it's through reading, whether it's through sitting down with you and doing role play, whether it's through having more observed sessions, whether it's through having more video, whether getting creative. Then it's follow-up, and how are we doing with that? Have we made progress or have we not? Okay, if we haven't made progress, then we might have to do things a little bit more formally. We might have to write this all out and have almost like a contractual agreement for what we're going to do as our next steps. And then have a meeting point at which you come back and say, okay, have we addressed the issue or not? And then if the issue is still not addressed, then what's the next steps from there? But having that really clear in the very beginning of the relationship for how remediation is going to occur, so a student knows what to expect, and that it's not this ever-evolving process that they're terrified of. But right in the supervision contract, being very clear that if we have to do remediation, this is what it's going to look like. We'll start informally, and then we'll go through a more formal process where there will be multiple check-in points. And if remediation fails, then we would talk about the termination of the supervision relationship. But having that so clear at the outset is so important, because the idea of remediation can sound terrifying and very punitive if you're not clear about what that actually means at the outset. And remediation, in my experience, can be around things around professionalism with clients. It can be around documentation as a really common point that remediation is required. Timeliness of documentation is a really important point. I think that there's remediation is required just around the application and use of certain interventions. Remediation can be required around case conceptualization and things like that, but it's so broad. It can be really in any area of practice.
Thanks, Erica.
CPA accredited comments? Programs and internships sites have to have this. I think, as Erica said, those are really good models. It's more difficult to implement those. They can be models for us, but as a private supervisor doing external supervision, those are hard to do just that way. I think an important part would be having a trusted third party. So that might be something a supervision consultant could assist with, because there's likely to be a dispute over, is my performance as a provisional adequate or not? If remediate, it's possible anyways, or another trusted third party, not somebody who has a vested interest in a private practice, for example. And this gets to I'm going to veer off a little bit. There's people want to look this up, a communitarian approach to competence and ethics that has been advocated by some folks who are kind of prominent in the APA. If you just you could probably, I could probably put something in the chat or circulate it, where we need to have folks in our professional networks that can call us on our crap when we're maybe not as on top of things as we should. Maybe we're experiencing health difficulties. Maybe we're experiencing a personal problem. Maybe we're operating at the edge or outside of our competence. We need to have a network of people who can say to us, look, shape up in a kind, loving way, right? So, yeah.
All right, thank you. We're down to our last 2 minutes, and so I think this is an appropriate time for us to pause, take a breath, and also to just thank all of the panelists for handling and fielding some very challenging questions. This is a topic, I'm sure all of you experienced this when you prepared for today. How am I going to get that in 15 minutes? How am I going to squeeze all, what could take days to get through and is, an entire course that Jeff teaches on this topic, and you still don't have the ability to exhaustively go through all the potential things that could be important to consider in this important topic. We want to thank all of the panelists again for their time and willingness to answer questions and be present for the for all of that today and for their presentations. I want to thank all the participants who've been hanging in all the way to the bitter end of 4:30 on a Friday afternoon. We really appreciate your willingness to participate. A lot of great discussion. And again, I greatly apologize for anyone I didn't get to. I know that there were a lot of great discussions happening in the background and questions we didn't necessarily get to today. We hope that this will be the beginning of an ongoing conversation with each other about this important topic. We think this is an important area that we all have to have a good handle on, and we think this is there's a lot of important issues that we still need to dialogue about, and we really value feedback and perspectives in doing that. So I want to thank you again. If you have any additional questions, you can see on your screen now a way to get those to us here at the college. We always welcome feedback, and there will be an opportunity to do evaluations of all the people who've done presentations today, and we welcome that feedback process as well and invite you all to do that. And so on behalf of CAP and all the panelists and presenters, we'd like to thank you again and wish you a wonderful weekend. And we hope to see you again next year when we have our next annual meeting and Professional Development Day, and we're looking forward to seeing you again at that time. Thanks again, and goodbye.